We begin this morning with new claims that members of the special counsel's team feel the public was misinformed by Attorney General William Barr's letter about their report. The New York Times reports that some of Mueller's investigators have told associates that Barr failed to adequately portray their findings, which government officials and others familiar with their frustrations say were more damaging for President Trump than indicated. While Barr says he needs time to make redactions, the Times reports that the special counsel's investigators had already written multiple summaries of the report. And some team members believe that Barr should have included more of their material in his 4-page letter. But government officials say the Justice Department determined that the summaries contain sensitive information, like classified material, secret grand jury testimony, and information related to current federal investigations that must remain confidential. While the report says that it was not clear what the findings the special counsel's investigators viewed as troubling for the president, Barr's letter says that on the obstruction of justice matter, quote, the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question.
And President Trump's legal team responded to the New York Times piece late last night. Rudy Giuliani saying, quote, if there was a significant difference, Mueller would have corrected it as he did the false BuzzFeed report. This is from disgruntled Mueller staffers who are rabid Democrat supporters. It's yet another example of unethical behavior by Mueller's staff. It also demonstrates that Mueller had people who leaked as much as Comey. How many leaks proved to be false? Most. It can't obscure the conclusion of no case for collusion or obstruction, says Rudy Giuliani.
The Justice Department declined to respond to the New York Times story, but the paper reports that Attorney General Barr's team has its own frustrations with Mueller. According to 2 government officials, Barr and other Justice Department officials believe the special counsel's investigators fell short of their task by declining to decide whether President Trump illegally obstructed the inquiry, leaving Barr to make a decision. But as NBC News reported, Mueller gave Barr and the DOJ 3 weeks' notice that he would not make a conclusion on obstruction. Officials familiar with the Attorney General's thinking tells the Times that Barr and his aides limited the details that they revealed because they were worried about wading into political territory.
All right, let's bring in one of the reporters who broke this story, Michael Schmidt of the New York Times. He joins us by phone this morning. Michael, good morning. Let me ask you if you can dig in a little bit on the question a lot of people are asking this morning about what exactly these members of the special counsel's team who spoke to you are upset about. Where do they see the conflict with what Bill Barr put out and what they put into their report?
There's an issue here with the narrative. The problems that the members of the special counsel's team have are with the fact that Barr was able to come out and essentially clear the president, but not give the details, the sort of fruits of the investigation, the fuller picture of what was found. They believe there is some troubling conduct there and that it needs to be looked at and the public should know about it. But in the way that Barr did that, he essentially cleared the president and gave no other information. And this has allowed, in the eyes of some, for the narrative to be set that the president did nothing wrong. Now, the president himself has exacerbated this by going out and saying that he was completely exonerated by the Mueller report. That is not what Barr said the Mueller report does. The Mueller report does not exonerate or condemn the president. It seems like it more provides a bunch of facts. And the special counsel's team looks at what the president says and says he is taking it out of context and twisting their work, and that bothers them.
Do the people, Michael, that you spoke to contest the conclusion as presented by the Attorney General that there was no collusion? That's been the headline for the White House and for a lot of people. From Bob Mueller's side of it, that means no evidence of a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Robert Mueller. Do the sources you spoke to out of the special counsel's office dispute that headline?
The sense is less on the issue of collusion than it is on obstruction. Barr was pretty definitive in his letter about what Mueller found on collusion, essentially saying there's no case to be made that the campaign conspired with the Russians. What it comes back to is the issue issue of obstruction and the picture that the report paints of actions the president took in office to interfere with the investigation. That, even Barr acknowledges in his letter, is something that Mueller couldn't make a decision on, and sort of lays out reasons for and against why some of the president's actions are so problematic. And the folks that are frustrated here see the president come out and say that he was completely exonerated on this issue. They know that that is not accurate, and they want the contents of the report to be out there. The problem is that when will that happen? When will the report be out, and when will people be able to decide? The problem at the heart of this issue is, how do you deal with the president's conduct? The Justice Department is there to decide whether people broke the law or not. They've decided that the president has not broken the law. The Attorney General has made that determination. So what information should be released to the public? In the case of Hillary Clinton, a lot of people criticized Jim Comey for holding his press conference and laying out what the FBI found. But in this case, it looks like the Justice Department is going to release a lot of what they did find in the investigation. So it's a very difficult balancing act when you have a high-profile investigation in which the public really wants to know what was found out, but there may not have been criminality.
So as you know well, Michael, the Attorney General in his 4-page letter made clear that the Mueller report does not fully exonerate the president, as the president has suggested it has. On the question of obstruction, though, the Attorney General's interpretation from Bob Mueller was that he couldn't determine one way or another whether there was obstruction. Are you saying that your sources inside the special counsel's investigation say that, yes, they do have evidence that the President of the United States obstructed justice?
I'm not sure how clean and clear-cut the special counsel is on their determination of whether the president broke the law. What our sense is that there is a lot of information and fact that they have found on this issue. They were unable to make a determination, and they wanted for that information either to be passed to the Attorney General to make the call or to someone else, but they couldn't come to it. They did a lot of work on that issue. They spoke to a lot of White House officials. They really delved into the actions the president took in office. What we don't know is why they didn't come to a determination. Why was it that they couldn't decide whether the president broke the law? And we won't have clarity on that until we see the report.
So, Michael, would it be accurate to say that part of the issue here with this morning's Times story centers around the fact that you had professional investigators, both legal, FBI, investigating things for 2 years? They did an enormous amount of work, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, especially on the obstruction component. And within the report, they are upset because of Barr's reference, sort of lightly referencing the obstruction component, when in fact the building blocks of the obstruction investigation, we won't know, as you pointed out, till we read it. But Bob Mueller's career is such that he would never issue a report leaving large questions like that unanswered. He might give direction, but wouldn't leave the questions unanswered. And that is the source of their anger over the Attorney General's behavior.
I think if their frustration is with the fact that Barr comes out and clears the president, but doesn't give the larger sense of what they found, doesn't provide the additional sort of fruits of the investigation that they thought were problematic. They didn't come to a determination on whether the president broke the law for some reason, and they obviously want some of these facts to be seen in a different light, either by the public or by Congress. Maybe, and I'm not sure of this, maybe they think that the conduct was such that it was problematic that Congress should look at, and that Congress may want to look at for impeachment, but may not be criminal. And maybe that is why they want it out there. Whatever it is, there's a rub here. Mm-hmm. There's a frustration here in how the end of this investigation was conducted. Well, that is clear.
Did you pick up anything in your reporting, Michael, that would indicate that some of the investigators are upset that they knew that Bob Mueller would not indict the president because supposedly the Justice Department does not want the rule the president cannot be indicted, and he didn't want to tie the thing up for another year and a half in court?
I'm not sure that they got that far. And when Barr puts out his letter, his determination on the 4-page thing, he said that they had not taken into consideration the question of whether the president could have been indicted on the criminal question, on what they decided, essentially saying, I don't think that they got that far. I don't think they thought there was even enough of a case to have made that determination. That's in Barr's eyes. Remember, Barr has to make the determination on whether the president broke the law. Mueller had not done that.
All right. New York Times reporter Michael Schmidt, thank you very much. Meanwhile,
thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.